Massive multiplayer online role-playing games have undergone a dark age with trying to revolutionize itself as a subgenre of RPGs since the creation of MUDs during the 1980s. Many games that started out as MUDs have given birth to newer games and newer franchises that went past the staples of games such as Ultima Online, and EverQuest took a more substantial leap by bringing the MMORPG genre into the 3D space from the 2D space. Final Fantasy XI was created as a rival to that of EverQuest, and Square sought to bring in their own innovations to make the game stand out as an ambidextrous undertaking that the company has never done for a mainline installment of their flagship franchise. Although Final Fantasy XI has managed to become Square Enix's most profitable game in the series, due to it being a long-term project with newer updates and revisions to satisfy its subscribers to their service, it would quickly be overshadowed in 2004 after World of Warcraft by Blizzard Entertainment hit the masses with its own subscriber base, surpassing that of Final Fantasy XI, as well as revolutionizing the convention set in the medium unlike any other. Instead of looking at Final Fantasy XI and its contemporaries as continued inspiration, many publishers and developers were beginning to see World of Warcraft holding that crown when it came to innovation, and more newer IPs such as Guild Wars saw similar success from there onward. Since Final Fantasy XI was now appearing more antiquated by many players despite there being a good following attached to the game, Square Enix knew that they would have to come up with a new MMORPG that would not only be a step up in visuals and gameplay, but one that would act as a rival towards World of Warcraft's success. Otherwise, Final Fantasy XI's subscription base would continue to stagnate in the long term. That would result in diminishing returns for the company if it did not get caught up with the times. 3 years after Final Fantasy XI was released, and acting as Square Enix's own MMORPG at the time, a new entry would begin its planning phase that would eventually become Final Fantasy XIV. In 2005, planning for Square Enix's next MMORPG started to take effect within the company's third product development division being at the helm of the project. Many members of the team who worked on Final Fantasy XI would be at the forefront of the game's development, such as Hiromichi Tanaka as the game's producer, Nobuaki Komodo as the game's director, Yaeko Sato as the scenario writer, and Akihiko Yoshida serving as the art director and main character designer. Yoshitaka Amano once again contributed to creating the title logo illustration like he has done for almost all of the games in the Final Fantasy franchise, both mainline entries and spin-offs combined. At the time of the game's planning phase, the newest MMORPG went under the codename Rapture. Even though Square Enix has decided that their own MMORPGs would be essential to mainline entries of their franchises rather than spin-offs, the team for Rapture was worried that the final product would end up being too radical for a main-numbered entry of any of their long-running IPs like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. This type of worry was somewhat commonplace when it came to the team's work on Final Fantasy XI during its development days. When coming up for the story on Rapture, Yaeko Sato based the game's story around a central narrative that ended up being complemented by numerous side stories. On the side of the art direction, Akihiko Yoshida needed to adjust from working on a single static project to creating artwork assets for a game which would be updated and expanded on a regular basis, a challenge that would be the complete opposite when working on separate games he was a part of in the past. Not much was known about Rapture when it came to its planning phase, but the game was first hinted at the 2005 Electronic Entertainment Expo when the company announced that they were working on a new MMORPG, as they had a tech demo to back it up. While the footage is regarded as outdated for today, the tech demo included aesthetic elements similar to that of Final Fantasy XI, such as the races that were from Vana'diel. In spite of this technical demonstration being shown, rumors began to circulate in 2006 that the demo was a hint that Square Enix was actually developing a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XI, but no more updates to that rumor were officially made public. At the 2006 Electronic Entertainment Expo, when Final Fantasy XIII was shown off running on Square Enix's Crystal Tools engine, the company decided to have that same engine be their proprietary engine for Rapture. Crystal Tools already proved to be a problematic engine that Yoshinori Kitase and his team within Square Enix's first production department were struggling with during Final Fantasy XIII's development, and it would only prove to be as burdensome for those working on the new MMORPG. The engine proved unsuitable to the needs that the team were looking for, rendering its internal structure as a broken system. Regardless of the problems that were bound to being beset within the team, Hiromichi Tanaka and the others would endure a vexatious development that would be far more troublous than Final Fantasy XIII. By the time when E3 2009 was finally rolling around, Rapture was finally unveiled at the Sony press conference, with it representing the 14th mainline installment to the Final Fantasy franchise, Final Fantasy XIV Online. This would mark the first time where a Final Fantasy game under the MMORPG genre would be playable in high-definition gaming, much like how Final Fantasy XIII was the first game in the series to represent the HD era. Even though Final Fantasy XIV was bound to release onto the PlayStation 3 within the next year, it was originally going to simultaneously launch alongside the PC version, which was announced shortly after the PlayStation 3 version. However, problems persisted in the game's build on the PlayStation 3 due to the console having much more limited memory than that of the PC, since Final Fantasy XIV was primarily built upon that open-source platform. So the PlayStation 3 version ended up being delayed as the PC version remained on schedule. Final Fantasy XIV was also going to release alongside the Xbox 360, but reports about an Xbox 360 version of the game being confirmed or exclusive were contradictory from the reality that was to ensue. A port of Final Fantasy XIV on Microsoft's home console hardware was under consideration from within the company. Seeing as how the Xbox Live service from Microsoft was very valuable and streamlined to the general public, Square Enix requested to Microsoft to allow the Japanese developer in placing a shared server on Xbox Live so that they would not need to undergo extra manpower in creating servers outside of Microsoft's network service. Despite their negotiations with Microsoft concerning an Xbox 360 version of Final Fantasy XIV, they would eventually come to a halt, as Microsoft would not give a third-party company like Square Enix the full access to the internal structure of their Xbox Live service to implement those shared servers the RPG developer wanted to place. Because of this disagreement, and the consequent extra manpower needed to develop a version separate from the other two platforms which were more powerful, development on the Xbox 360 version was scrapped. Yoichi Wada, who was the CEO of Square Enix at the time, declared that Final Fantasy XIV was being planned as a serious rival towards World of Warcraft, and ironing out the problems from Final Fantasy XI into Final Fantasy XIV was a top priority so that the game can be equally balanced for solo players and multiplayer parties from all over the world. Even though Final Fantasy XI used the Play Online service for that game, Final Fantasy XIV scrapped that feature, as the reasoning behind this decision was due to the marked decrease of content on the service. Instead, players would need to migrate to a new service that still allowed cross-platform play like Final Fantasy XI, and the service included the use of a universal Square Enix ID that would allow them to play from where they left off. Security tokens were also mandatory, as they are different codes for each login so that a player's data and information could be protected from security breachers online. Alpha and beta tests would come about, with alpha tests being available only to veteran players of Final Fantasy XI, and open beta tests were available on September 2nd, 2010, a few weeks before the game's official release. To promote its release, a collector's edition became available a week before its official launch, which gave those owners early access to the MMO, but it also included bonus items such as a DVD featuring a behind-the-scenes documentary, a security token, a case for the game's box, and a decorated tumbler. Undergoing a skirmishing task for about half a decade, and with the beta tests that took place, Final Fantasy XIV would finally release worldwide on September 30th, 2010 for the PC. Final Fantasy XIV takes place in a large high fantasy world known as Hydaelyn, with most of the game taking place on a continent called Eorzea. Both the continent and the world within Final Fantasy XIV would contrast to that of Vana'diel in Final Fantasy XI, as the game uses one name to refer to the entire world and its regions. Eorzea is broken up between three manpowers: the forest nation of Gridania, the desert-based Ul'dah Sultanate, and the thalassocracy of Limsa Lominsa, Eorzea's dominant maritime power. Other locations that became very important to the continent of Eorzea would be Sharlayan, a city-state that thrives with scholars, and a hostile but high-tech virulent superpower to the north called the Garlean Empire. 5 years back in Eorzea's history, the Garlean Empire raided the land of Alamigo, but they were stopped and prevented from accomplishing such a thing when a group of dragon hordes led by Midgard Sormr, the ancient dragon of the Beastmen, forced back the catty conglomerate with no problem. In response to the Empire's looming threat, and the overwhelming strength of the Beastmen tribes as they are being led by their deities known as the Primals, the nations of Gridania, Ul'dah, and Limzo Lominsa formed an alliance to reform the Grand Company so that each nation can share their military and economic assets to counter these eminences. The Grand Companies would attract many people of the enlightened races within Hydaelyn to take up the mantle of adventurers, and these adventurers would be created by many players from around the world. Final Fantasy XIV would pit players to create their characters based on the 5 races available, and many players would recall that many of these races, if not all of them, were very similar to the ones that were featured in Final Fantasy XI. These races would be composed of the Hearer, a human-like species that did not originate from Eorzea, as they migrated there along with their technology. The Hearer would be split into 2 clans, the Highlanders and the Midlanders, and they look very similar in appearance to that of the Humes in Final Fantasy XI. The next race would be the Lalafell, as they originate from the seas south of Eorzea, as their 2 groups would be the Plainsfolk and the Dunesfolk, and they have a very similar look to that of Final Fantasy XI's own Tarutaru race. The Mikote are mostly a race of felines, and they are not native to Eorzea, much like the Hearer and the Lalafell. Mikotes are divided by those who are the Seekers of the Sun, or Keepers of the Moon, and their appearance reflects that of the Mithra race in Final Fantasy XI. The Rugadine are a maritime race that mostly come from the seas north of Eorzea. Even though they appear like the Galka in Final Fantasy XI without tails, the 2 tribes within the race are the Sea Wolves and the Hellsguard. Finally, the Elizan are an elvish-like race very similar to the Elvon from Final Fantasy XI, who are native to the continent of Eorzea, and can coexist peacefully with the other races that are present. The 2 tribes between the Elizan are the Wildwood and Duskwights. Hydaelyn's history has been very dark and brooding, as it has become plagued with so many eras of catastrophic proportions which would foreshadow Eorzea's total demise. In the world's history, cataclysmic events known as the Astral and Umbral eras became a reality, with the latter having more of an effect along with undergoing an elemental alignment of each era throughout Eorzea's history. The first Umbral era was that of wind, as war was waged between 5 wandering tribes over Eorzea's land. Nothing much has been explained to that extent, along with the second Umbral era of lightning and the third Umbral era of fire that were to follow. Leading up to the fourth Umbral era of Earth, the reasoning for its cause was that of a power surge brought upon by the smallest of the 2 moons called Dalamud. This power surge brought upon by Dalamud would be responsible for transferring amassed solar energy to the Crystal Tower, while the Allagan civilization would face its destruction by a massive earthquake. The fifth Umbral era that was to follow would be that of the element of ice. It marked a period of Eorzea's history where it became an age of endless frost, an ice age in Hydaelyn that created a land bridge for the ancestors of the Mikote race, along with the influx and arrival of foreign fauna onto the continent. The Ice Age period is very similar to that of Earth's history of the Ice Age between the time of the dinosaurs and with man being the leading species in the world's evolution throughout time. Soon after the fifth Umbral era, the sixth one was upon Eorzea, which would be based on the element of water. This event to cause this time of cataclysm would be the War of the Magi, a war that is homonymous to that of the history set in Final Fantasy VI, but not the same war by comparison. Its conflict was amassed due to the wanton abuse of the land's ether by the 3 city-states of Nim, Amdapor, and Maha, and it provoked the anger of the elementals as a manifestation of their collective wrath, caused by the catastrophic flooding of the land to eliminate those 3 provinces. The current version of Eorzea featured in Final Fantasy XIV would be its present-day setting, along with its own city-states. The menacing force of the Garlean Empire and the despicable wrath of the Beastmen has the game's story of having the adventurers undergo many missions and quests from the Grand Companies as its main focus. Each of the many adventures that would come together would align themselves toward one of the 12, the pantheon of Eorzea that consists of 12 benevolent deities who ruled the continent and its surroundings until the arrival of the 5 wandering tribes that players can play as. Eventually, the land of Eorzea and its nations become united in trying to stop the legatus of the 7th Legion of the Garlean Empire named Nel von Darnus, who is attempting to summon Dalamud onto the continent. The efforts of the Alliance seem to be tried and true when battling the Garlean Empire in the land of Carteneau Flats, until Dalamud eventually disintegrates and reveals itself as a prison for sealing away the Elder Primal, Bahamut. Confined by his imprisonment, the rage that flowed within the Draconian makes Bahamut begin laying waste to Eorzea in retaliation. a prominent figure known as Louisoix Leveilleur fights back by trying to trap the Elder Primal in an etheric prison much like Dalamud, but it became a vain attempt, as Bahamut continues to run amok and cause more destruction in Eorzea's wake. Louisoix makes one last sacrifice in destroying Bahamut by withstanding its Terra Flare and piercing himself through the Elder Primal's chest, which causes it to explode. Right before Louisoix's sacrifice, he sends the adventurers in a time rift so that they can return back to Eorzea after it has healed itself from the scars of Bahamut's destruction, starting their adventure anew. For being the next Final Fantasy game to undergo the tradition of a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, Final Fantasy XIV borrowed many elements that were seen in Final Fantasy XI, along with some revisions, newer and additional elements of its own. For being an MMORPG that acts as a rival to World of Warcraft, several elements from that game would make the cut for Final Fantasy XIV to make it stand out from its MMO predecessor. Several servers are in place for players to select the appropriate one they want to play, and the worldwide release of the game allowed for everyone from around the world to start off at the exact same time without there being any experienced players at the start, addressing that complaint from the earliest adopters of Final Fantasy XI. For its basic gameplay, Final Fantasy XIV features a new system of class growth that enables players more freedom with choosing quests at the get-go. However, the game's primary focus is that of character growth, expanding upon the job system used in Final Fantasy XI, and having a more involved storyline that included cutscenes with voice acting, along with more complex and varied quests. After Final Fantasy XI received criticism for being more focused on forming parties to complete missions and quests, and less focus on solo play, Final Fantasy XIV balances out that option while keeping the cooperative play for those who still enjoy that feature. Unfortunately, voice chat would not be a present option, as text chat would return from Square's previous Final Fantasy MMO. Leveling up characters pits the player in acquiring experience points by performing various actions during the gameplay, such as killing monsters, crafting items, gathering materials, completing missions and quests, etc. Doing so and leveling up a character will increase their base stats for whatever class they are in, unlock newer skills, traits, and an increase of the number of abilities when they can cross between different classes to use their own ability for their currently selected base class. Doing these incentives for a character can help determine gear effectiveness, attribute caps, a gatherer's number of max gathering tries from a single node, and ability to gather from higher ranked nodes, and a crafter's ability to craft higher level items, despite its base attempt being often minimal. Players can play a game through the means of a solo adventure to grind their characters and classes at their own pace, but the most efficient way for them to earn skill points is to often party with other players. Doing this will allow for all the members of a party to earn bonus experience points so that they can obtain skill points at a much faster pace. A party of 8 members will help achieve optimal results and stronger buffs for each member, while between 3 to 7 in a light party will have the buffs be weaker than that of a full party. The best route to ensure this feat is for each player to display their online status, class levels, current location, search comment, and Grand Company affiliation so that parties can be formed at a much better leisure. When in battle, several elements from Final Fantasy XI also remain intact for this feature, but there are some newer elements added to help grow characters more. Linking and chaining monsters becomes a stronger benefit to grind a player's character. Linking monsters become automatic when they are attacked by a higher level character or their high level party, and the monsters will call their nearby allies to help them out. The number of enemy reinforcements is based on the differing factor between the strength of the monster and players it is engaged in combat with, but some monsters who are much stronger will not link with others. Killing monsters in quick succession will result in a chain, but that becomes more dependent if the player is that of a higher level to earn more experience points. Just like Final Fantasy XI, monsters in Final Fantasy XIV have an enmity system which will direct their attention on a single player, whoever the enemies have much hatred towards. Even though it is good on paper to make monsters have less attention on others while primarily focused on just one during the enmity phase, it is always best to keep that person alive so that the whole party can grow in experience. If players wanted to get even more technical with the enemy and boss encounters, pulling off combos based on weapon skills will grant them that privilege, as they won't affect those from fellow players. Combos can give off bonuses for the player based on the number of weapon skills they have available. For instance, by utilizing the following skills, certain combos can be executed. All 4 weapon skills will deal physical damage to a target, but their bonuses vary depending on which is used. The first weapon skill will grant a 20% increase in damaging an enemy when executed from the front, The second weapon skill will increase enmity, allowing the first weapon skill to increase further by 50%. The third weapon skill will give the first weapon skill an added 20% damage to enemies, as it'll increase the damage by 40% in total, and the fourth weapon skill will increase gradual hit point reduction from behind, while the third weapon skill will increase hit point reduction by 25%. Utilizing the different weapon skills and pairing them in different combos can give off different bonuses from one another, so the gameplay element in battles alone offer more of a risk versus reward factor. Final Fantasy's history of innovating the job class system has had its share of ups and downs over the years, while most adaptations of the gameplay element have been extremely favorable to critics and gamers, while certain variations of it came off with major scrutiny, which often led to underwhelming effects. Since Final Fantasy XI's job system was more in relation to that of Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy XIV's job system played out more in relation to Final Fantasy V, due to each class allowing players to take advantage of abilities from different classes altogether. Every character starts off as a base with no class to determine what affinities they wish to go by, more well-versed in strength, defense, speed, magic, etc., and vice versa on which they are less versed in. Final Fantasy XIV's innovation to direct a player's created character to their preferred job came in the form of a new class system, as several of them are configured through 4 base disciplines. Each class has its own weapon type, and changing between them is as simple as changing weapons, thus conceiving this element as the Armory System. The 4 disciplines in relation to the classes can come from the Disciples of War that consists of 5 classes, Disciples of Magic that consists of 2 classes, Disciples of Hand that consist of 8 classes, and Disciples of Land that consists of 3 classes. The classes within the Disciples of War are primarily aimed for those who are more prone for offensive combat through weapons, and those classes are made up of archers, gladiators, lancers, marauders, and pugilists. Archers make use of bows and arrows, which fits the description of the post. Gladiators make use of swords, lancers make use of spears and lances, marauders make use of two-handed axes like barbarians, and pugilists make use of claws and metal knuckles as they play out more as martial artists. The Disciples of Magic are for those who desire more affinity to use offensive and defensive magic spells in combat, and the classes that make up this discipline are Conjurers and Thaumaturges. Conjurers are more of the defensive magic class that use wands as their weapons, while Thaumaturges employ staves, since they are more of the offensive magic class. The Disciples of Hand use more practical and safer activities such as creating weapons, building structures, weave clothes, and craft medicines for use in battle. The classes in league with this discipline are Alchemists, Armorers, Blacksmiths, Carpenters, Culinarians, Goldsmiths, Leatherworkers, and Weavers. Alchemists end up crafting medicines as their forefront exertion, as they use Olympics for their weaponry. Armorers create stronger pieces of armor for protection, as they arm themselves with raising hammers in combat. Blacksmiths forge weapons in their exercise, while using cross-pane hammers to get the job done. Carpenters can use handsaws to build bows and staves for archers and conjurers. Culinarians are made up of chefs, who use skillets to prepare meals for themselves and other adventurers. Goldsmiths specialize in making jewelry, including most kinds of accessories, the scepters and staves used by thaumaturges, and fishing lures while arming themselves with chaser hammers to succeed their conditionings. Leatherworkers can process the hides of Eorzea's wildlife into material for making armor, accessories, and various furniture while equipping head knives, and weavers create various garments made from textiles, such as light armor for those within the Disciples of Magic, while using needles from spools of yarn and cloth that they process from various plants and certain animal fibers. Finally, the Disciples of Land is made up of those who undergo many activity on the land, such as botany, fishing, and mining. Thus, botanists, fishers, and miners make up this discipline, as botanists arm themselves with hatchets, while encompassing the procurement of resources from all forms of plant life, as those resources can be a necessity to other classes. Fishers harvest marine and freshwater animal resources from within the realm, so that they can achieve direct dealings with culinarians and goldsmiths, and miners excavate Eorzea's mineral wealth, such as ores, fossils, and precious stones, so that the resources can be useful for blacksmiths, and goldsmiths for weapon, equipment, and accessory creation. Each class within each discipline has their own unique merits and abilities over one another that it left many seeking potential with what all they could achieve if they were to borrow those abilities into the specific classes they preferred. Players would have to be at the max level of 50 if they were to attain 10 cross-class skills that they can customize at their exposure. Due to the nature of the Armory System, no restriction was placed on equipment, as the player can tack on any equipment on any class at any level, where the game scales it down based on the difference between current level of the gear to its optimal level to achieve full stats. However, a double-edged sword comes into play, as some gear may have favored classes, meaning that even though equipment can be used by everyone, the less affinity of equipment towards specific classes may incur a stat decrease, even if the player's level is at or above the optimal rank. This system provides a necessary help for players to change classes on the fly, since they are not forced to have completely different equipment sets for every class they play. Based on player feedback, class and level restricted items have been implemented, with most in-game gear requiring specific classes and levels to be equipped. For those who were largely in favor of playing a class that is primarily in league with the disciplines of war or magic, they would be given the opportunity to advance jobs if they were to learn specific abilities from other classes in the 4 disciplines that are available. There would be 7 different job advancements because of this, and they would consist of paladins, dragoons, monks, bards, warriors, white mages, and black mages. Paladins require the player to have the class levels of Gladiator be at 30 and a Conjurer be at 15, so that they can use both Marauder and Conjurer abilities. Dragoons require Lancers to be at level 30, with Pugilists being at 15, so that their abilities can be utilized from the Pugilist and Archer classes. The Monk job must be obtained by having the player become a level 30 Pugilist and level 15 Lancer, so that Lancer and Archer abilities can be at their disposal. Bards require the player to be at a level 30 Archer and level 15 Conjurer to take advantage of both the Conjurer and Thaumaturge abilities. Warriors are born based on the level 30 Marauder and level 15 Gladiator, so that Gladiator and Pugilist abilities can both be ascertained by the player. White mages must see a player reach level 30 as a Conjurer and level 15 as a Gladiator, so that Gladiator and Pugilist abilities can be properly used in the job. Finally, black mages must see a player require a class level of 30 and 15 for both Thaumaturge and Pugilist respectively, so that Pugilist and Archer abilities can be acquired. The quests and creative freedom for each individual can help determine their course of action, as long as their created character is aligned with one of the 3 grand companies that are based in Limzo Lomensa, Gridania, or Ul'dah city-states. On paper, Final Fantasy XIV's overall vision seemed like it would be Square Enix's next big MMORPG after Final Fantasy XI, with all of its additions and refinements that would make it rival that to Blizzard Entertainment's World of Warcraft. As big of an ambition a project like Rapture would become in being the 14th mainline installment to the Final Fantasy IP, its development history was plagued as being very tumultuous and problematic, possibly even more so than that to the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology. Even though Final Fantasy XI was a challenge for the likes of those who worked on that game when working on Final Fantasy XIV, trying to exceed the expectations of their previous MMORPG would not be that easy for the likes of Nobuaki Komodo and Hiromichi Tanaka. From presenting the cutscenes to working out the kinks within the Crystal Tools engine, something would always go wrong, where the team struggled to maintain an easy and steady workflow. In order for Final Fantasy XIV to be compatible with its own specifications, the development team customized the engine so that it could best suit their needs. However, the modified version of the Crystal Tools engine proved unsuitable to the team's needs, as its internal structure was rendered broken. The engine wouldn't be the only thing that would beset the game with multiple problems, as stuff like placing more attention on the game's visuals over content would be laid bare. According to a post-mortem of the original release of Final Fantasy XIV, the team had an unhealthy obsession of placing more emphasis on graphical quality over gameplay content that led to several parts of the game being neglected, mainly due to the company's then outdated development methods. A cited example to this problem toward the focus on graphics was a traditional flower pot, which had as many polygons and lines of shader code as the player character. This high graphical quality meant that compromises had to be made, such as limiting the number of players on a server to 20, undermining the large-scale communal appeal of MMORPGs. This issue also impacted Final Fantasy XIV's environments within Eorzea. In order to save on memory space while preserving seamless travel, the team needed to reuse environmental features and textures on a regular basis. Even though Final Fantasy XI was successfully overcome by the same team working on Final Fantasy XIV, their lack of experience in creating one MMORPG to multiple MMORPGs would be a major issue when going into 7th generation platforms. Reason being is because the team was still using the same development mindset that was primarily used during the 6th console generation of the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, and using that same development method for Final Fantasy XIV could not hold up under the need of increased staff and resources to get the job done. A third major reason was Square Enix's belief that the game's problems could be patched after the initial launch, but the extraneous amount of problems that were beset within the game made the team struggle with focus on how to counter them due to the lack of an overall plan. The effort from the likes of the development division for Final Fantasy XIV was very tried and true, but the damage had already been done, to what many found to be an unclean and sour mess. Due to these troubles during and after the game was completed, Final Fantasy XIV ended up being panned by critics for being a graphically beautiful, yet unpolished product that was inconceivably put out, marking it the first mainline entry to be overwhelmingly negative in contrast to its more successful predecessors. Many critics and gamers were critical towards the game's confusing user interface and broken mechanics that deemed the experience unplayable. Several websites, such as the now-defunct OneUp.com, described Final Fantasy XIV as like playing with a toy stuck in a plastic bag, where it can be fun for a while with getting the general idea of the game, but the full experience cannot be wholeheartedly learned until future updates would likely rectify the issues. IGN claimed that the game held much promise in the combat system and the crafting mechanics held much depth, but are under a sea of interface and performance issues that hindered the game from nearly every step. Not only that, but they deemed the world of Eorzea as not being worth it until future patches might improve the experience overall. GameSpot was far more critical by warning players to stay away as they deemed it a notable entry to the mainline installments of Final Fantasy, but only for what it lacks. Many other websites had criticisms that were very similar to the ones mentioned, but the vast consensus agreed that Final Fantasy XIV was mostly unplayable, due to it mostly being released as a product that was left unfinished. As a result, the most unanimous of all the criticisms was laid against the pace of both the gameplay and story, its convoluted interface, as well as the bugs and glitches that were all in place. Despite the critical nature that Final Fantasy XIV received, many agreed that the game's graphics were good, the overall music score of the entire game was very enjoyable, and the concepts behind the job and leveling systems held significant promise. With all the patches and updates that came about, some thought that the game had turned itself into something more playable. Regardless, Final Fantasy XIV was seen as a great disappointment for being an MMORPG and a mainline entry to the overall franchise. As damaging of a game that Final Fantasy XIV was toward the overall brand, its post-release would also come off a tumultuous feat for the whole company, especially when it came to the immediate backlash from players. Some of the controversy surrounding the game was primarily produced by the usage of gameplay features that seemed unusual and unworldly for the genre. The main complaint coming from players was aimed at the user interface, as well as problems with the performance and aspects within the gameplay. In response to this, Square Enix extended the initial 30-day trial twice to allow players to experience the updates that were to be in place by the new development team. Speaking of which, Nobuaki Komodo and Hiromichi Tanaka had been relieved from their posts as director and producer respectively, and Tanaka took full responsibility for the game's problems. The PlayStation 3 version was indefinitely delayed from its original March 2011 release date, as Square Enix said that it would not release that said version until it fully met the quality standards suitable for the Final Fantasy series, and subscriptions for the Windows version were also suspended in lieu of this. However, the changes within the game's service were not the only thing to come about, as the entire staff was restructured after Komodo and Tanaka's relief of their positions. Naoki Yoshida, who previously worked on another MMORPG from Square Enix at the time, Dragon Quest X, was brought in to take over the role of both producer and director. Nobuaki Komodo was reassigned to become the lead game programmer. Akihiko Yoshida became the lead scenario concept artist, while still contributing as a character designer. Hiroshi Takai was appointed as the lead artist, and Akihiko Matsui became the lead combat system designer. Naoki Yoshida's main priority after Final Fantasy XIV's disastrous launch was to make the game a more playable experience to rectify the subsequent reaction from critics and gamers. Several subsequent patches were made throughout the many months the original release was active. Many of these improvements would be based on multiple graphical and gameplay adjustments such as the addition of a job system, personal chocobos, a revamped battle system, greater customization options for gear, and a plentitude of brand new dungeons and bosses. Seeking help from fans on what to do in order to further improve Final Fantasy XIV's playability, Yoshida also introduced the official Final Fantasy XIV forums in order to obtain player feedback and suggestions so that the team can achieve a definite priority to interacting and growing closer to the overall community. During this period of refinement, Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV were taken offline to help with energy conservation in the aftermath and tragedy of the earthquake and tsunami that hit Tohoku, Japan in 2011. A week after the tragedy, the servers for both MMOs went back online, as other means were found to reduce their energy usage that did not involve their online services. Because of the earthquake that had happened, a planned and partially developed boss fight against the Primal Titan was cut and replaced with another Primal because of the seriousness and recovery from the aftermath that the team felt that players might end up becoming offended by the Eidolon and associate Beast Tribe's links with the power of Earth in this context. As desperate and important of a task it was for the team to fully mend the game to make into the fully playable episode for everyone to enjoy, Naoki Yoshida and his team failed to please everyone because of their inability to fully mend Final Fantasy XIV due to its existing form, its modified use of the Crystal Tools engine, and overall server structure since they were all critically flawed. Naoki Yoshida and his team made a unanimously difficult decision that in order to save Final Fantasy XIV from any more damage to itself and the Final Fantasy IP, the entire game would need to reboot itself as it would need to be fully rebuilt from scratch. This decision to launch a new version as a reboot instead of a new title was driven by the desired need of the team and Square Enix to regain player trust, as scrapping the entirety of the game itself would have painted a horrid picture of the relations between the company and its audience. What was seen as planned as the original story of Final Fantasy XIV was immediately changed to build up towards the end of the original game's life, with new boss battles being introduced to lead up to the final storyline. The 7th Umbral era storyline was used as a story-based reason for the radical changes leading up to the upcoming reboot and its landscape. In the run-up to this new version of Final Fantasy XIV being worked on, reduced subscription fees were reintroduced with special bonuses included for the eventual reboot, and major server merges were carried out to ease the transition between the original and reboot versions of the game, a move which initially provoked a negative reaction for players. This last and final revision of the game was put out on November 1st, 2012. After a final in-game battle where all the players of Final Fantasy XIV were invited, the servers were officially closed down on November 11th, 2012. Marking the end of the original release of Final Fantasy XIV and its existence. After the near-fatal and flawed launch of Final Fantasy XIV leaving a heavy impact on Square Enix while citing the game among other reasons for the company's shortcomings, they reduced its projected income for the year by 90%. After 2 extensions to the initial free trial period, the president of Square Enix at the time, Yoichi Wada, issued a formal apology to players and fans in December 2010, claiming that the Final Fantasy brand had been greatly damaged due to releasing a game that was mostly a broken and unpolished mess. During the next 2 years, Naoki Yoshida discovered a number of key tasks to improve Final Fantasy XIV by releasing new updates and patches that included some new features, scenarios, and events not seen in the game's original launch. Unfortunately, none of those additions could easily satisfy players who kept playing Final Fantasy XIV after its launch, so this led to the decision of both Yoichi Wada and Naoki Yoshida to reboot Final Fantasy XIV into a fresh, clean slate, while continuing to do the impossible. This brand new version of Final Fantasy XIV was codenamed version 2.0, which had been in development since January 2011, along with a tentative roadmap for future progress for both the PC and PlayStation 3. Monthly fees were reinstated in the original release, so that Square Enix could offset the costs of redevelopment on version 2.0 as a result. It effectively began in January 2012, and Square Enix constantly encouraged players to continue playing while paying subscription fees as they were granted exclusive bonuses such as their own in-game chocobo mounts and having their names in the credits. At E3 2012 in Los Angeles, California, Square Enix debuted Agni's philosophy to the public, and it was a tech demo for their new Luminous Studio game engine. Even though members of the Final Fantasy XIV development team worked on the Luminous Studio game engine, Naoki Yoshida admitted that version 2.0 of Final Fantasy XIV used a completely different engine, as the Luminous Studio game engine could only handle games that were primarily optimized for offline experiences, in which it could not handle online environments with over hundreds of on-screen character models. Ironically, he called this new game engine to Final Fantasy XIV version 2.0 and the Luminous Studio game engine as siblings, due to similarities in both of their structures. The following month after E3 2012, Square Enix finally unveiled that version 2.0's official title would be Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. As development for A Realm Reborn was beginning to ramp up in its production phase, Naoki Yoshida made the decision to shut down the servers of the original release on November 11th of that same year. That same date served as the grand finale of the original release, along with culminating a new cinematic trailer for A Realm Reborn called End of an Era. In 2013 at the Game Developers Conference, Naoki Yoshida delivered a project postmortem as he reflected his time with the original version of Final Fantasy XIV, along with the Herculean task of maintaining and updating an MMORPG, while simultaneously developing a new version over the course of 2 years and 8 months. Yoshida also explained 3 reasons as to why the original release of Final Fantasy XIV failed: an overemphasis on graphical quality, a lack of modern MMORPG expertise in the development team, and a mentality that all problems could be fixed in future patches. These reasons evolved from the team's prior experience on their previous MMORPG they created, Final Fantasy XI. As Final Fantasy has been renowned as a franchise for its state-of-the-art graphics, the original development team of version 1.0 gained an unhealthy obsession with maximizing graphical quality at the cost of server performance, which was unsustainable for an online game with tens of thousands of high-definition assets. In designing Final Fantasy XI, the team spent a year playing EverQuest, as it was deemed the most successful 3D MMORPG of the early 2000s. For spending their time with playing something that is mostly outdated by today's standards, the same team lacked experience with modern games in the genre, since the same team who transitioned to Final Fantasy XIV were instructed to make a game that was completely different from the one they previously worked on. Naoki Yoshida admonished that the team should have gone and played World of Warcraft for a year for inspiration, instead of what they already knew, since it surpassed both EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI on so many levels. As Naoki Yoshida would be in charge of both the directorial duties and the production for A Realm Reborn, Nobuaki Komodo would remain as the lead designer, Akihiko Yoshida would remain as the character designer and lead scenario concept artist, Hiroshi Takai became the assistant director, and Akihiko Matsui would remain as the lead combat system designer. Others who joined in on the project would be Akihiko Yoshida's longtime friend, Hiroshi Minagawa, who contributed as the lead user interface and lead web designer, Hideyuki Kasuga as the lead programmer, Kazutoyo Maehiro as the lead scenario writer, and Masayoshi Soken would be the lead composer of A Realm Reborn soundtrack, after he helped contribute to Nobuo Uematsu and the overall score to the original Final Fantasy XIV. Seeing as how there was no balance in making a Final Fantasy MMORPG attractive to hardcore players while trying to entice newer players to the franchise, Naoki Yoshida held a prevailing design philosophy for A Realm Reborn to simultaneously strike at that balance for both the core and casual audiences. As a consequence to this direction, Yoshida held optimizing gameplay for controllers as top priority in its development. To further streamline this development, he made about 400 fundamental design decisions which eliminated time lost to getting approvals, with a focus on implementing standard features to the genre first. This new workflow pipeline was initially tested in the updates to the original Final Fantasy XIV, before Square Enix pulled the plug on it to be more in favor of its relaunch. Plus, it was great practice for the team to test the waters of these new features before going with what did and did not work in its second release. Throughout this process, Yoshida made another top priority that communication with players and restoring their trust was the key to make sure that they did not repeat the same mistakes as what was done for version 1.0. even going as far to state that sales were secondary at this point when compared to redeeming the reputation of the Final Fantasy franchise. Live streaming conversations between the development team and fans, such as the letters from the producer live events, became a major element to Yoshida's overall strategy to reach toward players. Alpha testing for A Realm Reborn began shortly after the finale update of version 1.0 and lasted in late December 2012. During this time, Yoichi Wada admitted that the development of A Realm Reborn was a cause of delay for many Square Enix titles during that year. Naoki Yoshida published an updated roadmap to the beta test through launch that consisted of 4 phases beginning in mid-February 2013. Not to mention, he also went on and stated that the team was adamant about not releasing the game until it was fully ready, as launching it too early like with the original release would be at the level of destroying the company since Square Enix was in a position of financial woes during that time period. A release date for the PC and PlayStation 3 versions of the game was finalized and announced in May 2013, but the company would later announce that A Realm Reborn would also be arriving on the PlayStation 4 to take advantage of its PlayStation Plus online services and the Macintosh OS X operating systems, since Apple computers were on the level to where gamers could play games on Steam through the operating system, which A Realm Reborn eventually came onto within the next year. When Square Enix announced the release date for both the PC and PlayStation 3 versions of the MMORPG, a standard version would release in all territories, while Japan and North America would get their hands on a collector's edition for their respective markets. In Japan and North America, the collector's edition on both the PC and PlayStation 3 included a DVD-ROM to install the client for the game, a visual art book, a Blu-ray disc called Final Fantasy XIV Legacy, Waning of the Sixth Sun, that recaps the events of version 1.0 before its closure, a soundtrack CD entitled The Sounds of Eorzea, collectible art cards, a security token for one-time password use on every login done for A Realm Reborn, exclusive in-game items not seen in the standard edition, and packaging artwork done by longtime contributor of the franchise, Yoshitaka Amano. The European market would not get a collector's edition of A Realm Reborn, but they did get their hands on a Game of the Year edition the following year, that included a special Book of Diamonds Grimoire box that included the PC game with all the current updates, a game time card to allow a 30-day free trial, along with an extra 60 free days of play, and 5 collectible artwork postcards. Those who pre-ordered the game in advance would get early access 3 days early before its official launch. When it came to the PlayStation 4 release, PlayStation 3 owners were able to upgrade for free, but Japan also got their hands on a limited edition 500GB PlayStation 4 that had a laser-etched art of A Realm Reborn on the hard drive bay that was limited to only 1,400 units. For nearly 3 years of development, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn would finally release worldwide on the PC and PlayStation 3 on August 27, 2013. PlayStation 4 owners would not get a hold of the game until April 14, 2014, around the time when Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD Remaster launched on the PlayStation 3 in North America, and the Mac OS X version would come out on June 23, 2015. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn sees players returning to the world of Hydaelyn, with the continent of Eorzea returning as the game's main setting. The major city-states in Eorzea that consist of Gridania, Ul'dah, and Limsa Lominsa would return, along with the fourth theocratic city-state known as Ishgard, that is built in the snowy mountains of Kurthas. The events within the original release of Final Fantasy XIV are mentioned in A Realm Reborn, as the present events take place beyond the reach of time, where the adventurers are to be reawakened by the time they are needed once more. A Realm Reborn acts as a restart to Final Fantasy XIV, where the adventurers must go through many trials and tribulations, as the 7th Umbral era has been reborn into something different than what was destroyed by the Primal Bahamut in version 1.0. However, the Garlean Empire continues their conquest to take over Eorzea, while the Eorzean Alliance continues to resist their campaign, but much bigger threats have begun looming from behind the scenes that will affect the realm going forward. The races of the Hearer, Elezen, Lalafell, Rugadin, and Mikote all return for players to create their own adventure like before, but the new humanoid dragon race of the Ora make their debut in A Realm Reborn. The Ora are identified and characterized by their horns, scales, and tails, as well as their extreme sexual dimorphism, making the males tall and imposing, while the females are lithe and diminutive. Their two tribes have differing ideologies, as the Ra'in tribe consists of peaceful farmers, while the Zayla tribe features nomadic warriors. Several new conflicts between the three grand companies and the Garlean Empire would rise within this different Eorzea, as the adventurers must aid this different realm with creating the 7th Astral Era by defeating Gaius Van Baelsar, and they would need to re-establish the Eorzean alliance. The adventurers are also joined by Louisoix Leveilleur's grandchildren named Alice and Alphino, where they must learn the truth of their grandfather's demise. By learning the whole truth, the heroes and Louisoix's grandchildren keep the information of his sacrifice as a secret to themselves from the public, while enabling Bahamut and the captive dragons to finally rest in peace. Unfortunately, the evil cult known as the Ascians, the ones responsible for teaching the beast tribes to summon primals like they did for Bahamut in the original game, do not abide their time like before, as they currently end up bringing about the 8th Umbral Era, where their goals can fully bear fruition. Their action between them and the adventurers will eventually give rise to the most dangerous entity that oppose all of Highland, Zodiark, and it will lead to a final confrontation between it and the adventurers in the future. A Realm Reborn maintains most of the mechanics seen in the original release of Final Fantasy XIV, but several newer ones and revisions of older ones would take center stage towards the overall gameplay. The basic gameplay, leveling and partying, combo system, and base settings through the Armory System make a return, with either being the same or revised to fit the standards of what a Realm Reborn has going for. But Naoki Yoshida's newer elements and revision to the older elements would set the staple of how Final Fantasy XIV would be for the rest of time. Players who played through the original version of Final Fantasy XIV can transfer their created character to a Realm Reborn, either with all their stats intact, or rebooted in a fresh clean slate, while newcomers start off with creating their character from one of the 6 playable races within Eorzea. After going through the preliminaries of creating their adventurer, they start off in one of the 3 city-states, depending on the character's starting class within the 4 main disciples they choose from. Their adventurer and class level will start off at level 1, but their base class cannot advance to a newer one until finishing the level 10 class quests of their starting class. A player's primary objective is to go through the main scenario quests to get toward the end of that particular story in a Realm Reborn, and completing these quests will help the player gain experience points, gil, items, an airship ticket to fast travel to different places within Eorzea, the privilege to use a room at an inn, permission to do guild leave quests to obtain very rich rewards, access to visit the Gold Saucer for extracurricular activities, hiring creative retainers to hold a player's items as an upgraded storage, and being able to join the grand companies of Eorzea. If players go with the PC version as their platform of preference, they are permitted to play in the game with a mouse and keyboard, play on a gamepad, or both. Depending on their control of choice, the skill HUD will adapt to those specified controllers. While the PC version has the standard 12-slot hotbars for players to easily and quickly navigate through the different settings like any other MMORPG, those who play on the PlayStation 3 have a unique interface for the gamepad called the cross hotbar that has 2 sides. When players hold down the R2 shoulder button, the right half of the bar is highlighted with 8 total buttons that can be used to access a panel with their selected commands. The 4 main buttons on the right and the D-pad on the left make up the 8 buttons for the hotbar on the right. The same can be done for a left hotbar, as pressing the L2 shoulder button has those same number of buttons to execute the player's selected commands. Even though the PlayStation 3 version does not support mouse and keyboard control, that option became available to the PlayStation 4 when that version launched. For leveling and partying, they remain the same with some noticeable differences. Seeking parties are now done in 2 methods, the Duty Finder and the Party Finder. The Duty Finder is a dedicated party search system for undertaking instantaneous tasks, which allows the player to form an allocated party with other players, including ones from different servers on the same data center. However, the Party Finder, while limited to a current server, allows recruiting with more varied and specific criteria like participating in full active time events, or fates for short. If they did not want to take advantage of those methods of partying, players could manually invite party members at any time. The grand companies of Eorzea would make up the primary guilds that players can align themselves with, but a new guild system came into play called Free Companies. Free Companies are independent companies that are aligned with the grand company, as anyone who is a part of that guild are granted their own special privileges over the basic staples to a bigger guild that includes a shared housing system with special bonuses. The basic gameplay remained mostly the same with its sense of exploration, purchasing items and equipment, and joining one of the grand companies or forming one of their own, but the battle system too had its additions and revisions to make the experience a more streamlined and easygoing approach. The hit points, tactical points, magic points, and enmity system that came back from Final Fantasy XI and XIV play very similarly to each other, but the newest feature to combat is that of the franchise's signature limit break system that is mostly surrounded as abilities aimed for an entire party. Depending on which class or job that each adventurer is aligned to, they have their own set of limit breaks that come under 5 different categories of the gameplay element. Tank limit breaks are mostly for those who are amongst the knighthood classes like gladiators, paladins, marauders, and warriors that use conventional methods to help reduce damage of the entire party. The melee limit breaks are for those who inflict heavy damage on foes, where pugilists, lancers, rogues, monks, dragoons, and ninjas have access to that ability. Ranged limit breaks deal with ranged combatants dealing damage to enemies in a straight line in front of the player, with archers having that only type of access. Caster limit breaks has thaumaturges, black mages, arcanists, and summoners cast strong levels of magic to greatly deal damage onto foes, and healer limit breaks will grant conjurers, white mages, and scholars the ability to cast strong healing magic to cure their party. A special limit break for when in PvP mode called Adrenaline Rush is in place that allows a special ability from that specific class with their specific role to unleash that certain ability when in that type of combat. The limit break system in A Realm Reborn essentially replaces the Battle Regimen mode from version 1.0, as that feature was not that compelling for doing standard abilities that would either debuff an enemy or buff party members. Like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, a gauge is in place for players to fill it in order to execute their limit breaks by damaging enemies or taking damage from them. Negative consequences to receiving limit breaks also came into play, such as a decrease to a certain amount if a party member dies in battle, or if all players in a party share the same class or job at one time, will cause the limit break to fill more slowly than usual. In contrast to version 1.0, to where players weren't given the freedom to craft their own materials to customize their equipment options, A Realm Reborn implements this needed feature in full force. The crafting system is categorized into 5 sectors: synthesis, materia melding, repairs, desynthesis, and the gathering system. Synthesis is the basic form of crafting items from materials gained on a player's adventure. The quality of the materials also came into play, as materials with normal quality will undergo the normal progress of completing an item in due time, or by increasing its production through player progress, while the increasing quality will boost the chances of producing a high-quality product, as well as gaining additional experience points. The only downside is that the materials all have durability, and performing specific actions will cause them to gradually decrease, ultimately leading to the failure of the crafting and loss of the materials if the durability reaches 0. A material's quality can be categorized under 4 states: normal, good, excellent, and poor. Good and excellent will provide bonus quality gained if the relevant skills are used at this step. Poor occurs immediately after excellent, and will penalize any quality gains while not affecting progress or other skills during this phase. Certain skills can only be used while in good condition. Synthesis is governed by 3 stats: craftsmanship, control, and crafting points. Craftsmanship affects how much progress is increased by when using corresponding abilities, control affects how much quality is improved by when using corresponding abilities, and crafting points is used for various skills during synthesis. Players also must manage crafting points so that they do not deplete too quickly, and some abilities can restore crafting points if certain conditions are met. Materia from Final Fantasy VII return, but with new mechanics similar to that of materia fusion in Crisis Core. By completing the appropriate quest, players can also meld materia onto crafted gear. Melding requires the appropriate materia as well as the appropriate grade of carbonized matter by a crafter of the appropriate class and level. Most crafted equipment will usually have at least 1 materia slot available for melds, but special equipments will not have any slots as they cannot be melded. Materia comes in a variety of colors aside from green, yellow, red, blue, and purple, as their functions are more of adding bonuses and stats and elemental affinities rather than their base color symbolizing them for a specific function. Overmelding materia can also be performed by unlocking the advanced melding ability, which will enable extra materia to be melded onto gear. However, the ability of advanced melding came off more as a risk versus reward type of gimmick, as failing the process will make the adventurer lose both the materia that was being melded and the gil required to make it happen. Anyone who lacks the necessary crafting skill can also request other players to perform the action for them, provided that they possess the necessary items. This feature of melding is called Request Meld, and its interface enables a tip and gil to be given for that other player's services. Repairing gear is also coin essential to a character if they do not want certain NPC menders to repair their gear for themselves. By possessing dark matter in their inventory, manually repairing equipment will increase their current durability by 100% all the way up to 199%, allowing those items to last longer without needing immediate repair. Performing repairs has criteria set into the gameplay element, as the crafting class of a player's adventure must be at least 10 levels lower than the item's required equipment level. Using dark matter to do repairs can also be done at any time, including combat. Desynthesizing items and equipment that are natural or rare is also allowed by players, as they must be at least level 30 within a Disciple of Hand class to increase their chances at a successful attempt. Finally, gathering happens when players are on the field, whether if they are components of materia melding, excavation of minerals, etc. As items are gathered, nodes that bring up the list of items for a player to retrieve will lose health until it is depleted. Fishing is also a category under the gathering system. Gathering is governed by 3 stats. The traditional activity of gathering affects how likely an item can be successfully harvested or fished up. Perception increases the chance of obtaining a high-quality item, where the non-use of abilities will see the ratio being capped at 15%, and GP stands for gathering points and enables certain abilities to aid in the activity. The maximum amount of GP is set at 400, but unlike tactical points, it can be increased with better equipment, materia, and certain food. Returning from version 1.0, the Armory System between the 4 different disciplines arrive back for players to utilize, and they can learn the different classes within the different disciplines in order to gain their desired job. However, it received a few additions than what was seen in the original release. The Disciples of Hand and Land retain their same classes for each discipline, much like version 1.0, but the Disciples of War received 1 new class and job, whereas the Disciples of Magic received 1 new class and 2 jobs. Within the Disciples of War, the Rogue class was added as a dual-wielding knife class that involve activities of assassination, trickery, and thievery to get the job done, while the Ninja job performs the same job actions as a Rogue, while using ninjutsu combinations to turn the tide with their own Ninpo magic. The Arcanist class within the Disciples of Magic deals more with destructive magic, while the Summoner job performs incantations to call forth primals of their own, while the Scholar job does more by unleashing magical abilities that can hurt enemies or benefit the player and party members in combat. By having all of these elements in the gameplay intact, A Realm Reborn may have suffered a rocky start because of its newest features, and some of the ones that have returned, been revised, or were completely discarded altogether, but the entire journey ended up becoming a far more streamlined presentation than what was seen in version 1.0. With all these additions, revisions, and omissions from the original release, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn was met with a more well-received response from both gamers and critics, as well as featuring robust sales numbers. In contrast to the original release of Final Fantasy XIV being an unfinished and lifeless product, many people from the game's press and fans became very surprised by its overall quality, high level of polish, and the vast number of quality of life improvements to the whole experience. Even many people of the press went on and admitted that Square Enix ended up doing more right than wrong to make Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn a welcomed addition to MMORPGs of the modern era because of its improvements. Amongst the newest features not seen in the original version of Final Fantasy XIV, to making the game feel extremely comfortable with playing it on the PC or on a console with its streamlined approach toward the features used on the gamepad, A Realm Reborn gave a strong reminder to even longtime fans about what made Hironobu Sakaguchi's franchise a memorable and indomitable echelon amongst the many Japanese RPGs currently in the market. Ironically, they found Naoki Yoshida's dedication at making the game a more enjoyable experience, seeing as how he worked on many spin-offs and the 10th entry of what used to be Final Fantasy's greatest rival known as Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, however, did garner in some criticism, with those feeling that many features that were welcomed additions would seem overly familiar to players of modern MMORPGs. Plus, the PlayStation 3 version suffered from minor frame rate and loading time issues, as well as reduced graphical fidelity, where critics pointed out that the PlayStation 4 version eliminated those flaws to make it the definitive console version to play, while the PlayStation 3 version became easily outdated. Overall, critics and gamers became extremely satisfied with the overall results of what was established for A Realm Reborn, and its subscription base as of July 2016 culminated over 6 million users, excluding those from free trial members. By growing its user base upon its release, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn ended up putting Square Enix back into returning profitability for the whole company in 2014, due to its sales and traditional monthly subscription model that many players were satisfied with. Seeing as how Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn has over 80% of its subscribers being fine with the traditional monthly subscription model, Naoki Yoshida has no plans to change the game into a free-to-play model anytime soon. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn's initial success was very strong for Square Enix and Naoki Yoshida that they needed to plan a long-term relationship between themselves and their audience. Just like how Final Fantasy XI was updated with new content through various patches and expansion updates with so much new coverage, A Realm Reborn followed suit, as the development team came up with a schedule to release a major update approximately every 3 months from each other. The content patches for A Realm Reborn included a continuation of the main scenario, along with new raids, features, trials, and dungeons. Minor patches that came in between major updates focused on quality of life changes, as well as certain events that reflected toward a worldly holiday, or even something special that went on within a country or region like Golden Week in Japan. Expansion packs also came into suit, as Final Fantasy XIV needed to be updated with all new storylines, gameplay, jobs, quests, raids, and all of that to keep the game running fresh, much like Final Fantasy XI long after its release. Planning for the game's first official expansion began a year prior to its announcement. Naoki Yoshida wanted to have a storyline that was completely original, so that it would not be directly inspired by previous games in the franchise. Instead, the overall story for this new expansion would draw influence from real events, such as religion-based conflicts around the world, and the importance of recognizing the perspective that history is written from. To better understand the context of the whole scenario, and to get a better understanding of its events, the team wanted new players to complete A Realm Reborn story first, before accessing the new expansion. Yoshida explained the upcoming expansion as the second season of a televised program, remarking that people don't watch a televised show with its second season first, but watch where the show started so that people can get a clue as to what is truly going on. Other contributing factors toward the creation of this expansion were the launch of the Mac OS X client on June 23, 2015, as the port was handled by Trans Gaming. Unlike the console and PC versions of this expansion, the Mac release came available as a 2 games in 1 bundle, whereas the original platforms require players to buy the expansion separate from the original release. Another major focus was to update the game with DirectX 11 support, so that certain lighting, physics from water, reflections, and visual quality of shadows and textures can take effect. Not to mention, the new client with its DirectX 11 update ended up being less resource intensive on the GPU of a PC rig, so that frame rates could improve. Unfortunately, plans are not current for the game to be updated to DirectX 12. The expansion that came to release would be known as Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward, and the overall theme of the sky would be the influence for Naoki Yoshida to create this expansion. Heavensward released on the PC, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, and Mac OS X on June 23, 2015. Its tale would take place immediately after the events of the previous game, and the adventurer, along with Alpha no Leveilleur and Tataru Taru, make way for the austere and secluded foreign province of Kurthus and toward the holy city of Ishgard after being banished from Ul'dah, with the corrupt Crystal Braves and the Syndicate taking over the Sultanate, along with Revenant's Toll, that is home to the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. It would be up to the players to reunite with many allies they lost contact with after the players' escape, while continuing their battle with both the Garlean Empire and the Ascians, including the pacifistic resolve toward the everlasting conflict between Ishgard and the Draconian Society of Dravania. The regions within this expansion have mountainous locales with heavy snow-ridden climates to encompass the region's everlasting winter. Even a sky-based region called the Sea of Clouds would be playable. Heavensward saw various improvements and new features added to the overall gameplay, including the level cap being increased to level 60, since the original game and A Realm Reborn were capped at level 50. 3 new job classes are introduced in Heavensward, and those jobs would be Dark Knight, Machinist, and Astrologian. The new jobs going forward with Heavensward and newer expansions would not start off in a base class of their own. Dark Knights and Machinists would be amongst the Disciples of War, whereas Astrologians would be the only new class to take up the Disciples of Magic. Dark Knights are powerful knights much like gladiators and paladins, but offer abilities that are more in line with the dark arts. Machinists are a firearm-based class, where they craft guns and various attachments to them to help them enhance their gunplay skills that attribute to their dexterity. Finally, Astrologians channeled the power of the stars through their star globe weapons in order to heal and support allies while bringing down space warping destruction onto Earth in order to inflict ruin upon their enemies, making them the third job that primarily focuses on healing themselves and party members. These jobs require players to complete certain quests to access them and newer abilities, and they do not have a base class they need to start off with in order to make that job accessible to them. Not to mention, they become available when a character's class is at level 30. The newest Alliance map would be called the Shadow of Maha, and it revolves around the antagonistic machinations from Diabolos, the same Eidolon who debuted as one of the Guardian forces in Final Fantasy VIII. Diabolos originally appeared as the main boss to one of the dungeons from one of the patch updates in A Realm Reborn, but that Void Sin is brought back as the main foe in the new Alliance Raid storyline in Heavensward. Masayoshi Soken would be in charge of the music once more, but Nobuo Uematsu would return to write the main theme of Heavensward called Dragon Song, as Soken would use it as a musical through line which appears many times throughout the story and soundtrack. On top of which, this expansion would mark the first time in 5 years where Nobuo Uematsu would have some contribution to a Final Fantasy soundtrack, despite being the one who worked on the main vocal theme for A Realm Reborn. Heavensward was looked upon as a bellwether for the direction of Final Fantasy XIV, so that critics and gamers could determine if it was a detriment to bring the series back to its downward spiral in quality, or if the project would continue its track record of delivering on the promises that Square Enix managed to do after the original version's failures. Surprisingly, the expansion pack managed to do the latter, as Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward had a more appreciative status amongst the press, and it would receive very positive reviews as a result. A focal point of praise for Heavensward was centered on its story, as many pointed out that the plot's attention to the themes of racism and questioning of religious dogma, as well as the dramatic arcs of certain characters, were some of the most memorable done to the overall series. Even some have commented that the tale within Heavensward is one of the finest stories for the Final Fantasy series that Square Enix has managed to tell in a very long time. Critics were also very favorable toward the decision of players being required to finish the storyline of A Realm Reborn before jumping on to Heavensward, as bypassing the former storyline would be a disservice to an already gripping narrative. The positive praise that Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward received is often compared by the number of new gameplay elements that World of Warcraft: The Burning Crusade put out upon its release. Newer elements such as being granted the privilege to fly between regions after unlocking them in the game, and the deep dungeon that played out more to the roguelike dungeon RPG seen in some of Square Enix's past titles like Chocobo Mystery Dungeon on the PlayStation in 1997, attributed towards the praise of the expansion's content. Heavensward felt more as a reward for fans who gave Final Fantasy XIV a second chance after its botched launch in 2010, and it instilled confidence in the press and gamers who continued to enjoy the product. Heavensward would continue to be supported with updates on new gameplay, story-based scenarios, and raids up until 2017, and another new expansion would step up to continue A Realm Reborn's impressive track record. Being announced at the 2016 FanFest, Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood would be the second expansion to arrive for the MMO, and it would mark the official end of the game's run on the PlayStation 3, as support for the system was discontinued coinciding with its upcoming launch. The PlayStation 4, PC, and Mac OS X platforms would only be supported for Final Fantasy XIV moving forward, and Stormblood would arrive on June 20th, 2017. Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood takes place after the events that all transpired in Heavensward, and it sees the adventurers heading to the Girabania region in eastern Aldenard and beyond to the continent of Othard as they end up liberating the city-state of Alamigo in the Kingdom of Doma from the Garlean Empire's control. The region of Girabania goes for more of the same structure seen within Eorzea, since it takes place on the eastern part of that continent, but the continent of Othard bears more of an Eastern-style influence of countries such as China and Japan, instead of Heavensward feeling more European in its structure. Unlike Heavensward, where people must play through a Realm Reborn to know what was truly going on in the first expansion, Square Enix gave the option to where players can skip immediately to the second expansion storyline, but at a price. Stormblood increased the level cap to 70 for all disciplines, the battle system was revamped, as cross-class skills ended up being more determined by role rather than specific classes. The new areas are comparable to the ones featured in Heavensward by size, with flying mounts being supported. Swimming is a new mechanic for the adventurers to hunt for fish and discover villages and dungeons from underwater. 2 new beast tribes were introduced that consist of the Serpentine tribe called the Ananta and the Tortoise-like tribe called the Kojin. New primals were added such as Lakshmi and Susano. The inventory system is expanded. Exploratory missions are set in the Forbidden Land of Eureka, a high-end raid set in the Interdimensional Rift, where the adventurers can battle Omega from Final Fantasy V as a hidden boss, and the Alliance raid series called Return to Ivalice would be brought in. The Return to Ivalice storyline would be written by former Square Enix employee Yasumi Matsuno. The 2 newest jobs found in the Stormblood expansion are that of a Red Mage and a Samurai. The Red Mage job is both a caster of magic and a wielder of a rapier, while being extremely weak on both ends to compensate to the job's overall strength, and the Samurai job deals with the way of the Bushido while summoning abilities from within a blade to benefit them in combat. Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood would continue to deliver on that same critical acclaim status for Square Enix upon its release. Naoki Yoshida managed to impress critics and gamers once again for bringing about newer content that felt right at home to the overall game. The idea of going into Stormblood without having to complete Heavensward firsthand was well received, as players felt that they should be given that choice with how they should play Final Fantasy XIV for themselves, without having to complete a Realm Reborn to know exactly what happens next in a new update. Unfortunately, the need to pay in order to skip immediately to Stormblood's story was something many critics and gamers were critical towards, as it would cost $18 to immediately get through a Realm Reborn storyline, while getting through Heavensward's plot was $25. Speaking of which, the story garnered significant praise when it tackled different themes to its tale, such as war and colonialism, and the main villain of Xeno's Galvus has been labeled as one of the most deadliest, well-written villains to a Final Fantasy game in a very long time. Fans of Yasumi Matsuno and Ivalice were truly in for a treat, as that world's involvement in Stormblood's storyline became very gripping, pivotal, and extraordinary to the overall tone. When it came to Stormblood's criticisms, there were those who felt that the variety in the side quests were still lacking in the game, as that was a common problem in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, and the balance of level grinding between each main scenario quest felt way off to their eyes. On top of that, many critics and gamers thought that the new swimming gameplay was nothing to brag home about, as the underwater environments were underutilized in their design, although they did come off as visually appealing to a certain degree. All in all, many came to the consensus that Stormblood came off as an improvement over Heavensward, and the continued ideal of applying the traditional monthly subscription model made the game's routine between the base game and its expansions a winning formula. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn continued its strong delivery to gamers and critics long after Stormblood hit the masses in 2017, and the subscriber base was hitting at an all-time high, with nearly 14 million players playing the game on a daily basis. Even with these groundbreaking achievements hitting Square Enix on a monthly to a yearly basis with Final Fantasy XIV, the game was vastly approaching its 10-year anniversary after the original game's launch in 2010. With many hoping what was to arrive next for the MMORPG after Stormblood, people would know firsthand during Final Fantasy XIV FanFest 2018 that November about the game's next and most recent expansion, Shadowbringers. The announcement trailer showed off the main premise of what the story would be like, and it gave indications that the adventurers would be traveling to an unknown realm where the element of light has heavily flooded its grounds. It was there that the biggest feature would pit players to adopt the mantle that is opposite to the Warriors of Light, known as the Warriors of Darkness, a theme that was first shown in Final Fantasy III on the Famicom, and would be their objective to restore balance to the realm so that light would not be the dominating force over everything. After a few more months of fine-tuning, along with a plethora of additions and revisions to its gameplay, Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers would be available for early access on June 28, 2019, and then a few days later with a worldwide launch on July 2nd. Shadowbringers takes players into a new dimension known as the First, a reflection of the source that is opposite of the player's home world, and players take on the role as the Warrior of Darkness to restore that force into the realm that is already being flooded with the force of light. Amongst the additions to the expansion are the new playable region of Norvrant, which consists of two cities called Crystarium and Yulmore, along with their own areas to traverse in, such as the Raktika Greatwood and Amarang. The Vieira from the world of Ivalice become a new playable race in Final Fantasy XIV, while the Hrothgar make their debut. The Vieira are female exclusive while the Hrothgar are male exclusive, and the latter bears a strong resemblance to that of the Ronso race from Final Fantasy X, as that was what they were originally called in this game. In terms of new jobs, another two were added as they are the Dancer job and a new one called the Gunbreaker job. Gunbreakers are tank jobs like Gladiators, Paladins, and Dark Knights, and they pay an homage to the character Squall Leonhardt from Final Fantasy VIII, as the job has players utilizing gunblades in melee combat, along with abilities that are very similar towards the 8th game's main hero. The newest beast tribes are the Nummo from Ivalice and Pixies. The trust system as seen from Final Fantasy XI makes its debut, but in a modified form where the apparitions of the characters exclusive to Shadowbringers' overall tale can only be selected for the raids that are introduced in this expansion, as they cannot be freely summoned in the open fields. The New Game Plus feature makes its debut, as it will allow players to repeat storyline quests and battles that they have already completed, but with maintaining what they already learned from their last playthrough, a practice commonly seen in many role-playing games that uses the feature. 9 new dungeon raids are introduced this time around, a new high-end raid that is produced by Square Enix's own Tetsuya Nomura is brought about, a new Alliance raid has been gradually making its debut, with it being based on the Square Enix game Nier Automata, which Yoko Taro gladly produced, the level cap being raised to 80, and the tactical points gauge being completely omitted, as everything uses a magic points gauge. However, to accommodate to the technical advancements for this expansion over the last one, support for both 32-bit Windows computers and hybrid Macintosh models had to be terminated as they both require the use of the latest Mac OS update in full 64-bit mode to play the game. So far, Shadowbringers has brought about 2 updates with many more to make their leeway throughout the expansion's run, as the Nier Automata collaboration via the Alliance raid and clothing from 2B in that game have made their appearance. The reception for Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers has mostly been a smash hit amongst players and critics, and it is often seen as the highest rated Final Fantasy title in 13 years after Final Fantasy XII's original release. Whether Shadowbringers continues to go by being an improvement over Stormblood, with whatever upcoming content and patches it has in store remains to be seen, but the expansion being the highest rated game in the series currently has truly been a statement. Many people continue to play Final Fantasy XIV to this very day, and its abundance of newer gameplay elements that keep getting introduced with new expansions and the many updates that came along with them show that interest in that installment continues to grow for the better, even more so than Final Fantasy XI. However, many people within the current 18 million subscription base who are longtime fans of the franchise have noticed several elements within the game and its expansions that pay tribute or are transcribed as allusions to past installments for the modern times. What Final Fantasy IX did with covering most of the games that came out before it, Final Fantasy XIV goes above and beyond that by being labeled as the game with the most fan service and nostalgia to the overall franchise, including the more recent iterations and spin-offs combined. Not to describe some of the allusions and references from the spin-offs, Final Fantasy 1 through 13 will be covered. Not only would the allusions and references be rife within Final Fantasy XIV, there would be a few that would reference the overall franchise in general. In the original version of Final Fantasy XIV, there would be a cutscene that plays out where the 4 members of the Circle of Knowing, Thancred, Y'shtola, Ida, and Papalymo are about to engage in combat with Gaius, the primary antagonist, in a battle near the end. The way how the 4 members of the Circle of Knowing are standing between each other and right before the felled general is represented as a visual reference to how battles played out in the first 10 Final Fantasy games. The 4 crystals can also be seen during the animation of an ability called Swiftcast that can be used by the Thaumaturge class, and each of them represent the crystals of Earth, Water, Fire, and Wind in their respective manners. A miniature classic airship can be obtained as a pet, and the pointing finger cursor in the game is very similar to that of the previous entries that had that in their respective installments. As those few are a nod to the more ancient installments to the franchise, each installment would have allusions and nods in their own way when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. In the original Final Fantasy, one of the biggest standouts would be Y'shtola's mentor, who is a witch named Matoya. Her appearance along with her theme are alluded to Matoya from the original game, with one of the main scenario quests in Heavensward being titled Matoya's Cave. In Final Fantasy II, a character named Minfilia, the leader of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, uses the password Wild Rose to allow the player to identify other members of the Order, as it references the same phrase used by Princess Hilda of Fynn to identify other members of the rebellion against the Emperor and his empire. Plus, the Dreadnought would be one of the Garlean Empire's airships. In Final Fantasy III, the Enterprise airship is present, as it is the name of Cid's airship in Final Fantasy XIV. Plus, the story for the Crystal Tower Alliance raid is based on the same plot elements featured in that game. Final Fantasy IV's biggest standout would be the artifact armor for the Dragoon job being very similar to that worn by Kain Highwind, and the artwork for the job shares the same pose that Kain portrayed himself in Final Fantasy IV's logo by Yoshitaka Amano. When it comes to Final Fantasy V, Gilgamesh and Omega appear as bosses, while Shinryu is a primal in Final Fantasy XIV, and the theme song Clash on the Big Bridge plays during Gilgamesh's boss fight. Final Fantasy VI's references in Final Fantasy XIV are that of the Magitech weaponry that is used by the Garlean Empire, as they have grunts piloting Magitech armors to battle adventurers who stand in their way. The monsters Ultros and Typhon make cameo appearances as optional bosses during the same storyline that features Gilgamesh, and the boss battle theme from Final Fantasy VI plays when adventurers are fighting against the 2 pranksters. The Fall of Dalamud event in Final Fantasy XIV alludes to that of Meteorfall that ends up destroying Midgar in Final Fantasy VII, would become the game's big standout in the MMO, aside from limit breaks in the materia crafting system. Final Fantasy VII has so many allusions that stand out in Final Fantasy XIV, but probably one of the other most recognizable would be that of the Manderville Gold Saucer, as it is inspired by the Gold Saucer seen in the original game on the PlayStation. When it comes to Final Fantasy VIII, many of the infantry weapons used by soldiers of the Garlean Empire would be a variant of the Gunblade. For instance, Gaius Van Baelsar wields a gunblade called Airsbane, while another antagonist named Nail Van Darnus uses a gun halberd called Bradamante, a reference to one of the greatest female knights in Western literature. Other weapons that are variants of the Gunblade, such as Gunbok Nox and Gunshields, would be present. The Triple Triad card game also appears in Final Fantasy XIV, and it plays very similarly to that of Final Fantasy VIII. The Moogle mail system plays very similarly to that of Mognet, which was featured in Final Fantasy IX. The Weeping City of Maha has a boss named Ozma, who is based on the same super boss that Final Fantasy IX featured. When it comes to Final Fantasy X, the circle of birth, life, and death that is seen in Spira pretty much is the same when it comes to Hydaelyn. When a living being dies, it returns to the ethereal realm and reincarnate into new life. The primals can be called from the spirit energies in the realm that are called life streams, which is based on the same term used in Final Fantasy VII, but the calling of the primals functions very similar to that of the Aeons from the Far Plane. Not to mention, the battle against Bismarck plays very similar to the battle against Sin, since they both are giant flying whales being fought in the air, while the mechanics of the fight are very similar to that of Evray when fought on the Fahrenheit above the city of Bavel. Final Fantasy XI probably has the most recognizable allusions, since that was Square Enix's first MMO for the franchise, and the playable races are derived from the same scene in that game while having their own differences to not make them carbon copies of those seen in Vana'diel. Several beast tribes seen in Final Fantasy XI appear as upscaled versions of those same beastmen found in Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XII's biggest allusions and standouts in Final Fantasy XIV are that of the armor designs of the Imperial Legatus being based on the judges in Arcadia, and the members of the Ascians who worship Zodiark are named after the Scions of Light mentioned in profiles on the Esper seen in Ivalice, such as Kukuling using the Darkja spell that Zodiark used against Vaughn and his companions during the boss fight in the Hene mines. Plus, the Alliance raids for the Stormblood expansion take place within the country of Ivalice that is within Eorzea, with locales being based on the games from that universe. Lastly, Final Fantasy XIII's illusions seen in Final Fantasy XIV are that of the goldsmith guild of the old DOS city-state called the Estheim Lapidaries, based on the surname of Hope Estheim, and the costumes featured during the 3 games within the Lightning Saga are outfits that players can equip on their adventurers. On top of that, a limited seasonal event called Lightning Strikes has the adventurers fight alongside Lightning against several monsters found in Final Fantasy XIII when it came to their designs, and Motomu Toriyama assisted in the creation of its story. Several spin-offs such as Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy Type 0, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, and Bravely Default would have illusions of their own that would appear in Final Fantasy XIV, and other properties from within Square Enix that are not officially part of the Final Fantasy brand would get that same treatment, such as Dragon Quest X, Fullmetal Alchemist, the Kingdom Hearts franchise, and Xenogears. Even franchises outside of Square Enix, such as Capcom's own Monster Hunter series, has arrived in Final Fantasy XIV, as boss battles with Rathalos and Monster Hunter became available. On top of which, its structure in the boss fights is very similar to the combat and mechanics seen in that IP. Several religions, movies, video games, TV shows, and music would be referenced in the game as well. Aside from those latter references, Final Fantasy XIV surpasses that of Final Fantasy IX when it comes to its fan service and nostalgia that is present. Final Fantasy XIV's impact after a Realm Reborn released left a very potent and indelible impression amongst players from a global standpoint. There have been several stories from the overall community about how much the MMO left a very hearty recollection toward gaming as a whole, and the Final Fantasy series they grew very fond of. However, the one that left the most impact was from a player in Japan named Ichigeki Kakusatsu SS Nikki, who wrote a series of blog posts that went under the title Hikari no Oto-san, which translates to Dad of Light. Its history revolves around how much the Japanese player and his father were very big into gaming during the days of the Famicom, and games like Final Fantasy III was an adventure they had really fond memories of. Unfortunately, their time playing games together would take a head, as their lives would separate them into the unknown. By the time the father was 60 years old, he grew very attached to Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, and his son learned about this from his mother, who bought him a PlayStation 4 around that same time. The son wants to reconnect with his father to relive the same memories they had of playing Final Fantasy III, so he creates his own character, befriends his father's character in the game, and then finally revealed to him that the character his father befriended was his own son. The story was truly inspiring to not only fans who read up on the blog posts, but it also caught the attention of Square Enix as well. Square Enix decided that the story was enough to warrant an original creation to commemorate their MMORPG to the masses from outside of video games, and they teamed up with the companies Oricon, Mainichi Broadcasting System, and Tokyo Broadcasting System Television to distribute a Japanese drama called Final Fantasy XIV: Dad of Light. Its premise would involve a young man named Akio Inaba trying to rekindle the bond between him and his father Hirotaro Inaba, since they became very attached to Final Fantasy III on the Famicom. Final Fantasy XIV: Dad of Light would star Japanese actors Ren Osugi and Yudai Chiba, who would both play Hirotaro Inaba and his son Akio Inaba respectively, and the J-drama would release in Japan on April 16, 2017, with a worldwide release on Netflix that September. The show lasted for 8 episodes, and it became a well-received endeavor from both critics and fans. Just like Square Enix, many people who did not originally know about the blog posts found the premise of the show to be inspirational and motivative, and the deep bond between the father and son from the real world to the in-game characters within Eorzea became the fulcrum of great storytelling. After those 8 episodes were complete, no more were officially made, and it became more of a reality for it to be short-lived, as Ren Osugi tragically passed away on February 21, 2018 due to heart failure. Even with its short-lived status, Final Fantasy XIV: Dad of Light is still revered as one of the best Japanese TV dramas to ever release in the decade, and one of the best shows that was put out to a worldwide audience on Netflix. Looking back at Final Fantasy XIV, it looked like it was a game that would not have made any ground within the realm of MMORPGs, as Rapture was the start of possibly a new IP for Square Enix. It was developed within a time span of 5 years by mostly the same team who worked on Final Fantasy XI as their first MMO, but when the announcement of it being Final Fantasy XIV came at E3 2009, those who enjoyed the original adventures through Vana'diel were anticipating what Hiromichi Tanaka and Nobuaki Komodo could do to surpass what they already established. Unfortunately, their mindset of being stuck with making games from previous generations instead of adapting to a time where game development has become more ambitious in its production values and resources would ultimately lead to the game leaving a major scar that damaged the company's prolific franchise, where legacy members stepped down due to their inexperience of high-definition gaming. As a result, both Tanaka and Komodo would step down from their positions on the project, with Komodo continuing to assist in the game's development as the lead designer, while Hiromichi Tanaka left the company due to health reasons, but to be later employed by Gung Ho Online Entertainment. Final Fantasy XIV seemed like it would have been the game to kill off the franchise when it had begun to be less about the innovation and quality in its gameplay and more about being the next game to have more eye candy in its visuals than the others. The story, on the other hand, had so much potential, since the setting went for more of an approach to that of a high fantasy, as it was fresh from the same shtick that was mostly done by those within the first production department, where their own games were essentially heavily written with several plot holes and somewhat unappealing characters. Regardless, the damage was far done, that Square Enix was in a dire situation to either show less interest in the project or rethink their philosophy of game development within their JRPGs by reinventing Final Fantasy XIV from the ground up to be a more enjoyable experience. When Naoki Yoshida was brought in to be the main lead of the reboot, as he was more along the lines of a newer generation of game developers, as well as having a strong track record with the success of many of the company's games done for the Dragon Quest series, including Dragon Quest X, which is their other currently ongoing MMO as of right now, many began to see Yoshida's vision of where Final Fantasy XIV needed to be, since World of Warcraft was more of the dominant playground for those who enjoy the genre so much, instead of something that was outdated like EverQuest. Along with many legacy members and those within the company's corporate structure stepping down from their positions to leave Square Enix because of their preferred mindset or lack of understanding as to what gamers, consumers, and their fans want, the successors coming into the company and the new blood coming in on the project has led many to believe that Final Fantasy XIV is marked as the renaissance for the dominant Japanese RPG company after Realm Reborn was officially released. It innovated and drew inspiration from other big hit MMOs in the market, and it being rife with so many allusions to past entries, newer gameplay ideas, and storylines based on the expansions that came out, made many of those believers begin to see a Realm Reborn as a blueprint for future Final Fantasy games and Square Enix titles when it comes to its quality in the Japanese space. Right now, the developers of Final Fantasy XIV and its expansion set in its reboot within A Realm Reborn continue to pursue other platforms for the game, and the company could possibly ensue discussions with Nintendo to bring the game to the Nintendo Switch, along with resuming talks with Microsoft to bring the game on the Xbox One, and possibly the new Xbox Series X. As long as the world of Hydaelyn and the continent of Eorzea continue to exist, Final Fantasy XIV continues to flourish and prosper itself and the overall series with its quality, and it has become an extremely important title to Square Enix and longtime fans. Those who wish for future expansions in Final Fantasy XIV and further installments of the Final Fantasy franchise from Naoki Yoshida's mindset cannot wait for what he will come up with next, and we will be the judge to know if his next creation will continue his philosophy that was seen in Final Fantasy XIV, or if it will possibly exceed it. Next time in Double RPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, the next installment of Square Enix's flagship franchise would be initially conceived as a third game within the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology, with Tetsuya Nomura being helmed as the director, but its overall scope would grow into a much bigger idea when it would transition from Fabula Nova Crystallis to a new multimedia project that would lead it as the next original installment on 8th generation consoles.